What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. So we're just over 24 hours away from arguably the most important hockey game in NHL history. I don't think that's an exaggeration to say when looking at the fact that the Edmonton Oilers are going for the 3-0 comeback, when the face of the league, arguably the most talented player in NHL history, is attempting to get that first Stanley Cup. The viewership numbers are going to be absolutely insane. Social media is already buzzing. So I wanted to look at what is at stake besides the Stanley Cup. There's no shit the Stanley Cup is at stake, but what a win or loss would mean for these two franchises overall, for their reputation overall heading into the summer, as well as for the players. What a win or loss would mean for their legacy. So we're going to dive into it right now. We're going to start with the team's overall franchise, what the impact would be. So let's get into it. Up first for the Edmonton Oilers, a win would obviously complete a top 3 comeback in major professional sports history, the Big Four in North America. When looking at it, coming back from 3-0, it's only been done in the NHL once by the 1942 Toronto Maple Leafs. The fact that they could maybe pull this off is just absolutely insane. It would be up there with the 28-3 New England Patriots comeback in the final 17 minutes of the game, as well as the Boston Red Sox coming back from down 3-0 against the New York Yankees. It would be insane for them to fully pull this off, as well as them getting bragging rights over all of Canada, considering the fact that nobody has won the Stanley Cup since 1993. And on top of the fact, it's not only that they'd be breaking the streak, but they also won 5 Stanley Cups from 1984 to 1990. Maybe Montreal fans, no, not even that much. Montreal's still going through rebuild, but Montreal would be the only team that could maybe talk, considering they were the last team to win and the last team to win back in 1993, as well as the fact that they did win in 86, as well as a bunch of Stanley Cups in 1970s. But besides that, Toronto Maple Leafs, Vancouver Canucks fans, Calgary Flames fans cannot chirp the Edmonton Oilers at all until they win a Stanley Cup at the bare minimum. Even if Vancouver or Calgary somehow beat the Edmonton Oilers next year in the playoffs, you can't chirp because you still don't have a Stanley Cup. Meanwhile, Edmonton has a goddamn Stanley Cup. Now, also for the Edmonton Oilers, a win would fully mean that the decade of darkness that they went through would be justified. It would be warranted. It would no longer be this absolutely horrendous stretch if it eventually led to a Stanley Cup. If you don't know what I'm talking about, from 2007 to 2016, there was a 10-year stretch where they did not make the playoffs a single season. The year after they made the Stanley Cup Finals, went on a 10-year stretch where they didn't make the playoffs. They didn't finish with above 54% points percentage once, and all but 3 of those seasons were below 75-point pace. They were just horrible. This was my childhood. I knew the Edmonton Oilers for being a sorry-ass franchise, but as a result, they got Ryan Nugent-Hopkins in 2011. They got Leon Draisaitl in 2014. They got Connor McDavid in 2015. I guess you could say the decade of darkness was worth it once they got McDavid, because he was that generational talent, but this would really just be the climax in terms of them winning a Stanley Cup. Those years still will not be looked at as good, but at least it led to this. It led to this core that is going to win the Stanley Cup. Now, what a loss would mean for the Edmonton Oilers, it would get pretty dicey this offseason in terms of massive moves getting made, considering they'd be entering the final year of the Evan Bouchard and Leon Draisaitl contracts, where they're only making $3.9 and $8.5 million. I think 2, maybe 3 of Cody Ceci, Darnell Nurse, Evander Kane, and Jack Campbell probably would be on the move. Whoever the new general manager, assuming Ken Holland would move on after a loss, would have to get extremely aggressive, and rightfully so. Canadian fans would start to chirp the Edmonton Oilers, even though, again, it would be a pretty stupid chirp considering they didn't make the Stanley Cup Finals, but the Edmonton Oilers would get shit on if they do not pull off this 3-0 lead. Now, 3-0 comeback. Now, when looking at the Florida Panthers, what a Stanley Cup would mean for them, what's at stake for them, it would solidify them as a legit hockey market. Not saying that they are the Arizona Coyotes level bad. Before that, they've clearly been on the rise, especially of late, but getting that Stanley Cup is so massive. You look at a Tampa Bay in 2004 to really solidify them as a legit franchise, as well as just recently in 2020 and 2021, they became cream of the crop with the Stanley Cup. The Florida Panthers, this would be the culmination of this Aaron Eblad and Alexander Barkov core that got laid down when they were so horrible in the early 2010s, similarly to the Edmonton Oilers. When you look at the Florida Panthers, the last 4 years, they've been wildly successful. 2021, safe playoff team, very, very good. 2022, President's Trophy. 2023, Stanley Cup Final, and then 2024, winning that Stanley Cup. They've arguably been, I'd say, probably the second best franchise during the 2020s behind the Tampa Bay Lightning, and especially they would have bragging rights over the Tampa Bay Lightning. Although they beat them in the Stanley Cup playoffs, it's not the same to when you don't have a Stanley Cup. You know what I'm saying? They'd be able to say, we beat you and then we won the Stanley Cup. It wasn't just we beat you in the first round and then lost in the second round. Now what a loss would mean for the Florida Panthers, it would be fucking devastating. They'd forever be known as the biggest chokers in NHL history, most likely. It would be very, very bad for their overall reputation. They would get clowned nonstop, even though, again, they have been more successful than like 95% of teams. But still, rightfully so, they would go down in the history books. And if this core never won another Stanley Cup, this core would be deemed a failure just because of that 3-0 lead. So when looking at it and then heading into this offseason, what that would mean, Reinhart, Montour, I'm not sure you're bringing back both of them if you see the way that they played in this series and you blow that 3-0 lead. So there would be some massive changes on top of the fact that I think Aaron Eblad could potentially get moved from the Florida Panthers. He has 1 year left at $7.5 million and only a 12-team no-trade clause. He's not close to a $7.5 million defenseman right now, even the regular season, not that much. So I think you could potentially move off Aaron Eblad in the same way where Huberdeau was coming off 115 or 116 point season, but maybe they get aggressive and maybe they trade a key piece in order to shake things up. Bill Zito is not afraid to do that. Now moving on to the players in terms of what the legacies would mean. Connor McDavid becomes a no doubt top 10 player of all time with the Stanley Cup. I don't think that should be a hot take by any stretch. When looking at it, he'd have 3 Harts, 4 Pearsons, 5 Art Rosses, 982 points, the consensus best player in the entire NHL for like a 4 to 5 year stretch, or 5 to 6 year stretch, as well as winning the Conn Smythe this season, having one of the greatest playoff runs of all time. Assuming they win Game 7, he's probably going to pass Mario for the second most points in a single playoff run. I don't think that he's going to get the 5 points necessary to pass or tie Wayne Gretzky, but he would be a top 10 guy of all time. Trending to no doubt be a top 5 guy, even if you conservatively estimate the rest of his career. Let's say he never wins a Stanley Cup and he only goes on to win 1 more Hart, 2 more Art Rosses, and has another 700 to 800 points. That's still going to be a top 5 career of all time. He's going to pass guys like Ovechkin, Jagr, Messier, I'm trying to think, Hasek, Lindstrom, in my opinion, that maybe he still wouldn't be ahead of after he wins the Stanley Cup. But if we actually say what we think is probably going to happen with Connor McDavid if he wins the Stanley Cup, then has like a realistic end to his career, it's probably another cup, 2 to 3 more Harts, 3 to 4 more Art Rosses, which ends up to be like 5 or 6 total, 8 to 9 Art Rosses, as well as like over 2,000 career points. That's going to be a second greatest player of all time, and you can maybe make an argument that given the salary cap era, given the expansion era, the distribution of talent, that he's a greater player of all time compared to Wayne Gretzky. I know that it might be sacrilegious to say that, but he's definitely on pace to potentially challenge Wayne Gretzky one day if he caps this off, if he gets the Stanley Cup, and definitely on pace to be the second greatest player of all time. I know that might be crazy, but if he ends up losing, you're going to hear the Crosby heads come out of the woodworks and say, he couldn't get it done. He went down 3-0. He wasn't that good in the first 3 games. They lost because of him. He's not a closer. He's going to get shit on, unrightfully so, but I do agree that he needs to win a Stanley Cup at some point. If he is going to pass a Lemieux, a Gretzky, even probably a Sidney Crosby, I think he will eventually win a Stanley Cup regardless of what happens in Game 7. But in order to get ahead of those guys, I think he does need to get at least one. Next up, Leon Draisaitl. If he does win the Stanley Cup, I don't think it's ridiculous to say that he's trending to have kind of like an Evgeny Malkin level career. I'm not sure he's going to be as good as Evgeny Malkin, but he's definitely tracking to be probably like a top 40 player in NHL history, considering he has a Hart Trophy, already has 850 career points, and basically since that 2020 season where he won the Hart, has been a top 5 player in the entire NHL. I think he's going to finish probably north of 1,500 career points. Not sure he's ever going to win a Hart or Art Ross unless McDavid gets hurt, similarly to Evgeny Malkin when he won in 2012. Because Crosby was hurt, he was the best player in the league that year, don't get me wrong, but it was also because the actual best player in the league got hurt. But when looking at it, if he finishes off his career with insane totals, multiple seasons above 110 points like he's trending on right now, I think he's going to retire a top 40, maybe top 35 player of all time, around that Evgeny Malkin, Patrick Kane kind of level. I don't think that that's ridiculous, but if he loses, not saying people aren't going to say that he's like not a future Hall of Famer, but he's going to get criticized a decent amount, rightfully so, because although he has been hurt clearly in this series, he doesn't only have 3 assists in 6 games, only has really shown up in Game 6, really was aggressive right out of the gate, but he will get criticized a decent amount, especially considering last year also, although I think he was dealing with some injuries last year, especially after he got slashed by Pietrangelo, but last year when he got eliminated by Vegas, great in the first 2 games, he had 6 goals in the first 2 games, but after that only had 1 assist in the final 4 games. So there's going to be some criticism for Draisaitl, but nothing really to like massively shake his overall standing in terms of all time. Bouchard with a win, I think is undeniably a top 10, sniffing on top 5 defenseman in the entire NHL. I think you got to accept the fact that this guy is an offensive dynamo, above a point per game this year in the regular season, and in the playoffs, currently the 3rd most points ever by a player in a goddamn run. And when looking at him, I think that he would potentially be trending to one day be a Hall of Famer. I know that might be crazy to say Evan Bouchard a Hall of Famer, but considering the year that he had at 24 years old, he's probably only going to get better. His decision-making, his defensive positioning, which yes, he has been out of position a decent amount in this series, is only going to get better. Now, if they lose, he's going to get criticized considering in the first 3 games, he was very underwhelming from a defensive aspect. You look back to the Evan Rodriguez when he passed it right to him, then Evan Rodriguez rifled it home. So if they do lose, he's going to get criticized a decent amount. I understand why maybe people would keep him outside of the top 7, top 8. I probably will still have him in my top 10, but if they win, you got to give the guy flowers, and regardless, this has been a fantastic series by Evan Bouchard. Cory Perry with a win, I think basically locks up a Hall of Fame spot. I know it probably shouldn't work like this considering he is a bottom 6er, but when looking at it, another Stanley Cup for Cory Perry after making the Stanley Cup final so many times recently, but losing this Stanley Cup with his veteran leadership, which is important in the game of hockey, impacting this team, helping them pull off the greatest comeback of all time, is going to be very impressive and will probably get him the bump. If you don't think that he's already in my opinion, he's kind of a 50-50. This might slightly nudge him towards being a Hall of Famer. On top of the fact, I know one play, one goal shouldn't matter, but when you talk about the Edmonton Oilers Stanley Cup final and Stanley Cup run, what highlight is going to be rolling during that? It's going to be the Connor McDavid power play assist to Cory Perry. That shit kind of matters. So I think Cory Perry definitely locks up a Hall of Fame career with the win. Stuart Skinner goes from we need to find a new starter this summer, we need to trade for UC Saros, to he's only making $2.6 million the next 2 years. That is a fantastic deal. This guy's Vezina caliber. This guy's an absolute stud. The narrative is going to flip, especially considering how clutch this guy has been in games 4 through 7. When looking at him, he has a 943 and a 1.4 this season in games 4 through 7. It hasn't been pretty early on in series, but when it matters, this guy has really shown up. Now, if they lose, if he shits the bed in a game 7, I think it's very possible that they do bring in at least a seasoned veteran backup in order to be the backup for, or the potential starter for, Stuart Skinner if he is inconsistent like he has been proven to be. But if he wins the Stanley Cup, I think that it's his net next year and it's his net going forward, and rightfully so, the way that this guy has been playing towards the end of the season. Darnell Nurse, it's still a bad contract, but if they win, he's going to be forever an Edmonton legend. When looking at it, drafted him all the way back in 2013, 7th overall. Yes, the contract is bad, but Darnell Nurse, Stanley Cup champion, fans will always have a soft spot for him. He might still get traded even if they do lose, if they can somehow get out of that contract. If they do lose and he's a massive liability, I don't think he's ever going to get bought out, or at least right now, given how insane that buyout is. But if they do lose, he potentially could get traded. Now, going over to the Florida Panthers, Matthew Kachuck. Matthew Kachuck, if they win, the Matthew Kachuck trade is going to go down as one of the greatest in NHL history. Considering first season, guy's a Hart finalist, guy carries them, him and Babowski, carry them on the offensive side and the goaltending side to a Stanley Cup final. They lose. Then the next season, they win the division title. They make it back to the Stanley Cup final, and although they almost blow it, they go on to win the Stanley Cup. Matthew Kachuck being a star of that team. But if they do lose, he's going to be kind of the face of this choke. When looking at it, he has not been playing nearly good enough. 1 goal, 2 assists, 3 points in 6 games right now. And on top of the fact that he also got eliminated by Edmonton back in 2022. Edmonton would have punked him back-to-back years, or not back-to-back years, two times in 3 years as the division champs. He would go on to lose to Edmonton, and yeah, he'd be getting shit on a decent amount. Now, when looking at Babowski, I think that a win would definitely lock up a Hall of Fame career for Sergei Babowski. Probably, I would already have him in the Hall of Fame, but I think that a win would definitely put him over the top. When looking at him, he does have almost 400 wins, 2 Vezinas, but a loss, not saying that he wouldn't be a Hall of Famer, but it definitely opens the door for a potential, considering he has been not that very good. He was actually better in Game 6, but Game 4 and 5, it was very bad. There's a chance that maybe he wouldn't be a Hall of Famer one day if they lose this game, if he falls off next season. Because although he does have 2 Vezinas, he does have almost 400 wins. He hasn't had the most consistent career. Besides, coming into this season, outside of the 2 Vezina wins, he only had his third highest finish for the Vezina outside of the 2 wins was 8th place. He was far too inconsistent. His peaks were fantastic, but year over year, he was maybe not as consistent as some other guys of the era. I still think he's going to be a Hall of Famer, but there's at least an argument for him to potentially not be a Hall of Famer if he loses his Stanley Cup final. Alexander Barkov, if he wins it, I think he's going to win the Conn Smythe most likely, unless Babowski absolutely goes off, and he's going to be on his way to not be Patrice Bergeron 2.0. I don't think he's going to win 6+ Selkies, but he will be regarded as the best two-way center in the entire NHL. Probably rack up some more. He's already going to be a Hall of Famer most likely, but this would basically lock it up. So when looking at him, if they lose, I don't really think he's going to get that much shit because he has been the one-star forward on Florida that has really shown up, in my opinion. Not that he has locked down Connor McDavid. Well, he kind of did in the first 3 games, but when looking at it, he showed up. So if they lose, I don't think that there's going to be people are going to be like, Alexander Barkov's insanely overrated. I can see it with Matthew Kachuck, given his play in the Stanley Cup Finals, but Alexander Barkov has really showed up. So there's not too much losing downside for Alexander Barkov. Aaron Ekblad's a very interesting guy because I think if they win the Stanley Cup, he all but guarantees himself to get his jersey retired with the Florida Panthers. You look at him, got drafted at first overall in 2014, although I got criticized for giving him a C in terms of draft grades because I don't think that he's been that good for a first overall. Still, he would get his jersey retired. He's been there for a decade. He has every single record for a defenseman. Not that there's a ton of fantastic defensemen that have played in Florida, but he has all the records. He's been there for a decade. He wins a Stanley Cup. But if they lose, again, I wouldn't be shocked if he gets traded. $7.5 million. I could see him. Zito's definitely keeping Forsling, considering he just signed him to a deal. On top of Brandon Montour, you might say, I like Montour more than you. You're getting shipped out. I can maybe get something for you. Some team might want your leadership, might want your potential bounce back if you can return to 2022 form. So I don't think it's out of the blue. That it's not out of question that if the Florida Panthers lose, Aaron Ekblad potentially could get traded. Now, when looking at Montour and Reinhart, this is kind of a 2-in-1 because these guys are both UFAs. If they win, they're probably going to re-sign with Florida. Florida's just going to lock them up because they're a Stanley Cup winning team. But if they end up losing, I could see them both losing out on a lot of money considering they've not been that good in the Stanley Cup Finals. On top of Bill Zito saying to one of them, yeah, we need to free up some more money for the depth. You're not worth what you're asking for. Hit the goddamn roads. They can be on new teams if they end up losing this and if they're not that impressive in Game 7. Verhaeghe, if they win, just turns into one of the best acquisitions of recent memory. When looking at it, signed a 2-year deal at $1 million after he won the Stanley Cup in 2020. That's his other thing. He's going to win 2 Stanley Cups, which is pretty impressive for him. But he got signed on a 2-year deal at $1 million. Came in immediately, 18 goals, 18 assists in 43 games during the COVID-shortened year. And since then has been a very, very good first-line winger for them. On top of the fact his second deal was 3 years, $4.1 million. But if they end up losing, he's going to get a decent amount of the blame on top of the fact that he's extension eligible on July 1st. And I'm not sure Bill Zito is going to be frothing out the mouth to give him this massive deal, considering he's playing the Stanley Cup Finals. He has a -9 somehow. That is so impressively bad. I know the plus-minus isn't the best stat, but he has not been that good in the Cup Finals. So he's going to lose himself a decent amount of money if they do lose. Vladimir Tarasenko, he's a pretty interesting one. If they win, I'm not saying that he is going to be a Hall of Famer, but he keeps the small chance that he could be alive. When looking at him over a 5-year period, he had the second most goals in the entire NHL, only to Alexander Ovechkin. He never scored 50 in a season, but he was a very reliable top-end goal scorer, second best goal scorer in the entire league for a long term, and he was a massive piece to the 2019 St. Louis Blues, either best or second best forward with Ryan O'Reilly. And on this Florida Panthers team, maybe not a top 4 forward on this team, but he has definitely been important. So I think that he would keep the possibility of the Hall of Fame alive. I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's 5% likely. But if he has good longevity for another 3 to 4 to 5 years, scores 55 to 65 points every single year, and can win another cup or two, maybe down the line, he could one day be a Hall of Famer. If he has 3 to 4 Stanley Cups, 900 to maybe even 1,000 career points, and he's just a fantastic winner, maybe doesn't have those awards that some other guys have, I could maybe see it happening. I'm not saying it's likely, but it's definitely possible. If they lose, I think you'd probably kiss that dream goodbye in terms of him winning the Stanley Cup. And then lastly, Kyle Okposo. I'm only going over if they win for him. It doesn't really matter if they lose. But if they win, one of my favorite players of all time finishes off an all-time career. I'm obviously an Islanders fan, but Kyle Okposo, very underrated career, 614 career points in 1,051 games. He only made the playoffs 3 times before the season and only won 1 playoff series with my New York Islanders. Never made it with the Buffalo Sabres, obviously. So it would just be really cool for me to watch one of my childhood players probably cap off his career. Not saying it's a guarantee that he's going to retire, but I could easily see him do it. He's only split time between New York and Buffalo and then gets straight to the deadline. It'd be pretty fitting if he just finishes off his career, announces that he retires right after he lifts the goddamn Stanley Cup, on top of the fact that he gets a nice $500,000 bonus that was written into his contract when he re-signed with Buffalo. That obviously didn't hit, but now it's maybe going to hit with Florida. That would be fantastic for me. I'd probably shed a tear if Kyle Boeser wins the Stanley Cup. But let me know in the comments, what do you think? What are some other takes that you have depending on who wins the Stanley Cup? How does it affect certain players' legacies? And I'll be seeing the next one.